Hi, I'm Scott Beaulier, Director of the Johnson Center for Political Economy here at Troy University and host of EconVersations. Thanks for tuning in tonight. On tonight's show, we're going to talk to one of my colleagues in the Johnson Center, Dr. Daniel Smith, about some of his recent work dealing with tornadoes and recovery from tornadoes in two places that got hit particularly hard last year in 2011, Joplin, Missouri, and Tuscaloosa, Alabama. The work that Dr. Smith is doing is extremely important in that it helps us understand how cities going forward can respond appropriately and do the least harm when it comes to business recovery and encouraging people to get back on their feet. And it fits in nicely with the themes of the Johnson Center, which focus on free markets and economic freedom. So Dr. Smith, great to have you here.
Thank you.
Let's get right into it. You've made a big splash recently with a Wall Street Journal piece talking about recovery in Joplin and Tuscaloosa. Before we get into some of the controversy of that piece, let's just remind people about the two big tornadoes in 2011. There were other ones, of course, in Birmingham and other places, but the Joplin tornado and Tuscaloosa tornadoes are the focus of a lot of your research right now. And why did you focus on those two in particular?
Well, every disaster is unique in many aspects, so it's very hard to compare different disaster recoveries, especially if you talk about hurricane versus tornado. But there's a few similarities between the Joplin and Tuscaloosa tornado that allow us to make some comparisons. For instance, it was an EF4 tornado in Joplin, and it happened a month after the is EF4 in Tuscaloosa, EF5 in Joplin. And they were only a month apart, very similar sized towns, similar damage. There's 8,000 buildings destroyed in Joplin, 5,700 in Tuscaloosa. So it allows us to gauge their recovery since it happened at the same time, similar damage, and we can get some insights on disaster recovery from that.
And in fact, if a person were to look at the two tornadoes, just in terms of the size and the destruction, you would say that Joplin got hit harder because it was an EF5 versus an EF4. Having been to both places, Joplin, from what I saw, it wiped out a really big chunk of their city, including the hospital and a couple of schools that were right in the path. Tuscaloosa's location of the tornado wasn't in quite as vital an area to the city. So when you look at recovery in the two places, you would think that Joplin is going to be dealing with a lot more difficulty than Tuscaloosa, other things constant, right? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And just the pace of the recovery, also Tuscaloosa has a month advantage on Joplin. So you're absolutely right. You would expect Tuscaloosa to be recovering quicker than Joplin.
But that's actually not happening. Your Wall Street Journal piece from just like a couple of weekends ago is titled Why Joplin is Beating Tuscaloosa when it comes to recovery. And what do you mean by beating here? What are the things you're looking at to make a claim like that Joplin's outpacing Tuscaloosa?
Before I get into that, it's important to clarify that it isn't a race. But what we know, especially from Gulf Coast recovery research, is that if businesses don't return quickly in a community, that community may not respond. The longer it takes for buildings to start showing up, the longer residents are going to stay away and the less likely they are to return to that community. So a community can be fundamentally restructured or may not ever return if businesses don't quickly reestablish themselves. So that's why we said beating, is because the speed of rebuilding is an important aspect in gauging the resiliency of a community. And what we found is that the businesses in Joplin were able to quickly reestablish, rebuild. There's a Walgreens, there was a Chick-fil-A that were both open in 3 months. There's the Walmart was open in 6 months. Home Depot, they opened up fairly quickly with a tent store and then quickly rebuilt as well. I think theirs was 7 months. Where in Tuscaloosa, you see businesses are still struggling to get permits and to reestablish themselves.
So in response to your Wall Street Journal piece, the mayor of Tuscaloosa, Walt Maddox, came out within a couple of days and said, it's not all about speed, it's about the quality of recovery. And, it's fine for Joplin to be going fast, trying to get businesses back up and running, but in Tuscaloosa, this is an opportunity for them to rebuild in a way that's careful and focused on the long term and brings in new standards when it comes to building codes and brings everything up to speed so that maybe they can sustain a tornado in the future too. What's wrong with that mindset, and how would you respond to his argument that, look, we're interested in recovering too, we just have a very long time horizon relative to Joplin?
Well, it's important to note that what we're talking about and arguing against is beautification, zoning, and regulation. Regulation and zoning that's related to the square footage of greenery in front of a business. After disaster, it's not the time to be getting into disputes like that, or if you should have 16 or 17 parking spaces. Businesses, if someone came into your house and threw everything around, you would immediately want to put it back to where it was to get to a return to normalcy. That's what these business owners want to do, but they're prevented from doing that if you add on additional regulations and zoning. Even if you don't add on additional zoning and regulations, a lot of grandfather businesses that have been deeply rooted in those communities and long established relationships in the community, they're built and grandfathered in under previous zoning laws. So just to rebuild back to the current zoning laws, they're already facing a lot of uncertainty and cost. And they just want to return to what was normal prior to the storm. So if you add on additional uncertainty or regulation, it's really going to impede the ability of these businesses to quickly reestablish commerce.
In conversations with you, you've described the Tuscaloosa approach as trying to build Paris, basically. And is there a long-term plan really that specific and focused on just beauty and carefully designing an urban landscape? And would you describe the Tuscaloosa approach as more like Houston, Texas, where it's anything goes? We're just going to let, Houston's really well known for being a city that really doesn't have zoning policy. Just whatever you want to build, go for it with some very minimal guidelines. Is that the distinction that you're making between the two places?
Yeah, absolutely. Tuscaloosa they're trying to rebuild Paris, and they're trying to centrally plan a city, manage every aspect of the recovery, what businesses can return, what sections of the city they can return in, the what type of color schemes they can use in building their business, the entryways, every single aspect of rebuilding is managed and addressed in the long-term plan that isn't focused on getting businesses, the businesses that are struggling right now, that aren't engaging in commerce right now. All the costs fall on them, and they're the ones subjected by this long-term plan that's looking 30 years in the future. Well, if the community doesn't respond now, and this is how the city treats business owners, are future people going to want to come in, especially business owners want to come back to that city. Whereas in Joplin, what you saw is kind of the French economist Bastiat said, he made this statement that Paris gets fed, or at least he appreciated the fact that no one centrally plans how Paris gets fed, yet it does get fed. So Joplin adopted that mentality and said, you know what, businesses, churches, charities, you lead the recovery efforts, and you start reestablishing commerce, start putting back your buildings. That's the best way for a community to respond.
If we can talk just a bit more about this plan in Tuscaloosa, where is it coming from? Is it coming from business owners and community organizers, and is it kind of organic, coming from a lot of input from community, or is it just something that some architects have come up with and said, we think for this amount of space, you could do this with it? Do you have any sense of what's inspiring the grand plan?
Yeah, absolutely. Tuscaloosa, immediately after the storm, they issued a request for proposal for a comprehensive urban planner. And after they got that plan, and after the mayor had seen it, they created a citizens advisory council that consisted of, it was expanded to 10 people, only 3 of which were business owners. Where in Joplin, they took several months. It wasn't until December of 2011 that they put out a request for proposal for urban planner to help, mainly for networking reasons, to create private-public partnerships. And they created the Citizens Advisory Recovery Team that actually consisted of, there's 27 members on that team, or, well, depending on, there's different teams on there, but there's a total of 31, and 22 of those were actually business owners.
Okay.
So they engaged the business community and involved them in the planning process to a far greater extent than Tuscaloosa did. And important thing to say is that when you pull any disaster-stricken community after disaster, everyone's going to want underground utilities, they're going to want water parks, they're going to want all sorts of goodies. Yeah. But the thing is, you have to protect the private property rights of those businesses that create the community, are in the center of the community. and ensure that they're able to rebuild. If you take a long time and evaluate all these plans and try to rebuild Paris with all these different aspects, the businesses are going to leave, and they're going to flee to Northport, or they're going to go under.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially when you create ambiguity, whether you actually have a right to go into your destroyed home and start to rebuild. I know moratoria were in place briefly in Joplin just to get the debris out of there, but also in Tuscaloosa. And that has to be a tremendously difficult period for people to know how long is this going to last, what can I do while it's in effect, and just it creates a lot of uncertainty. I want to ask you just a little bit and tell folks about just how involved this research project was in terms of the time and the energy that went into it. How did you collect these data? You're not just sitting in your office here in Troy reading newspaper accounts. You've been out in these places for extensive periods of time. Can you tell us a little bit about the number of folks you've talked to, who you're talking to, and what you're trying to do with all of that hard data that you're gathering in the field?
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a very important point about our methodology that we employed. In disaster recovery research, there's a long history of attempts to try to quantify resiliency in communities. And what we found is a lot of those attempts have failed. We've tried to use post office recipients in the Gulf Coast research, but actually they went through the recipients and they found that some of that mail was going to FEMA trailers or going to homes that no one lived in anymore. So there's a huge problem with trying to quantify, especially in post-disaster contexts, these types of stories. You can't put numbers to human experiences and stories, and that's why we employed this methodology where we got on the ground in Joplin and Tuscaloosa. I was in there for 2 weeks in each city, conducted about 40 interviews in each city, business owners, charities, government officials, church officials, to try to get the most comprehensive view of what was going on in the city, what were the issues, what was helping recovery, what was impeding recovery.
Having been to both places, I would imagine, and in fact I have read that one of there are two stories as to why Joplin's different from Tuscaloosa. One is this cultural explanation that, well, you have just this Midwestern work ethic versus Southern, very laid back attitudes about, well, a tornado happened, we're going to work through this and get going again, but it's more relaxed in terms of the speed of doing things. I wonder, what you would have to say to that. How do business owners feel about wanting to get going again in Tuscaloosa? Are they really laid back, and is there a cultural component to it? And then second, there's this argument that you hear about the Alabama outbreak of tornadoes that day, that there were a whole bunch up and down, all the way up into Birmingham and North Alabama, and even south of Tuscaloosa, if I remember correctly. So the tornadoes were spread out, so you're dealing with resources having to be spread across a whole bunch of Alabama, whereas Joplin, it was that one big tornado, and you could concentrate a lot of energy there. To what extent are these factors contributing to the different outcomes in the two places?
Well, the main cultural difference I saw was actually in the approach to depending upon federal money, where the officials in the city of Joplin, they took the approach, the federal government can come and help out, but we're not going to wait around for them. We're going to start rebuilding now. We're going to start recovery efforts now. In fact, when FEMA arrived on the scene, they actually asked the people in Joplin, does everyone in Joplin own a chainsaw? Because they were amazed that the streets had already been cleared by the people of Joplin. Where in Tuscaloosa, the city took a completely different approach, where they're depending upon federal money to help in their recovery efforts. And the fact that there's other tornadoes going on in Alabama on that day actually highlights the importance of not depending upon federal bailouts when it comes to disaster recovery. Communities need to depend upon the business owners to reestablish commerce, start generating tax revenues. That should be the long-term recovery plan, is letting the business community come back, rather than depending upon federal bailouts that may not be there, especially with growing federal deficits.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point, and if you pay attention to Mayor Maddox's remarks about why recovery has been slower than they would like, it has to do with federal grant processes relative to 2005, and he says Tuscaloosa could be much farther along towards being fully recovered if they were just getting something close to what post-disaster areas were getting in 2005 and earlier. And he seems to be still putting a lot into this idea that if they keep working towards getting some additional federal monies, then the city will come back. It seems like you're saying don't wait for that money, and it's totally perverting your thinking about how to recover if you're allocating a lot of energy towards getting federal grants instead of just let's get busy growing again.
Yeah, one of the central aspects of the Tuscaloosa Forward Plan, which is their long-term recovery plan, is that they're going to zone out of existence previously poor and primarily minority neighborhoods that the mayor has actually come out and said they weren't performing up to par. This is a chance to rebuild those communities. But unfortunately, they're trying to rebuild those communities, but the people that live in them won't be able to afford to live in those communities after they rebuild to these plans. And they're being driven out of the city. And actually, poor people around the city, economists have argued, is actually a sign of a vibrant city, because poor people are attracted to a city in which they have lots of opportunities. So trying to zone those neighborhoods out of existence is going to, in the long run, hurt Tuscaloosa.
How are they going about doing that? Just putting, if your home was in or near the tornado area, deeming it unsafe to live in? Because otherwise they'd be using eminent domain or blight or something to condemn people. And I'm assuming there are huge civil rights issues along with property rights violations that are taking place.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of civil rights issues at stake here, especially in the state of Alabama, which hasn't been on the right side of a lot of civil rights issues in its history. And it's unfortunate to see this type of someone in the name of the disaster recovery to rebuild a city to try to zone out of existence these poor communities that have been deeply rooted in Tuscaloosa for a long time.
Let's talk about the takeaways from this project and what other cities who encounter a natural disaster, whether it be an earthquake or a tornado, or we're nearing hurricane season now, and who knows if a Gulf Coast community is going to get hit this year. What are the big lessons learned for other cities who are bracing for a possible disaster or who have had one and need to figure out the way forward? What are the simple rules you'd recommend based on this research?
Yeah, I'm actually going to split that up into prior to a storm, what a city can do, and then after a storm hits. Prior to a storm, while I said that natural disasters are hard to compare around the world, what you do notice is that around the world, those communities that have thriving businesses, dynamic entrepreneurship, those are the ones that recover the most comprehensively and most rapidly following a natural disaster. And we know there's a robust and consistent relationship between economic freedom and economic prosperity. So the more cities, communities, nations adopt economic freedom, rule of law, limited government, private property rights, and enforce those before a storm hits, the better equipped their community will be to robustly respond to a natural disaster. So not only is economic freedom, we know the recipe for it, and it can be implemented before a disaster even strikes. And then the second part of that is what a community can do once a disaster strikes. Well, I'd recommend two things from our lessons in Joplin and Tuscaloosa. First is allow churches, charities, and businesses to lead the recovery efforts. And then the second is to sensibly waive regulations, zoning, and licensing laws that can inhibit response and recovery efforts.
Well, let me ask you a little bit more about both of those points. This seems to suggest that we have some idea of why New Orleans was slow to recover after Hurricane Katrina. Yes, it was a really big storm, and yes, we didn't fully anticipate in the region just what a storm of that magnitude could do, but New Orleans and the state of Louisiana, well in advance of the storm, had a history of corruption. It wasn't the best managed city. Property rights and the encouragement of business activity in the state wasn't great, so it's no surprise that recovery there was quite a bit harder. I've seen international comparisons between the earthquake that Haiti endured a few years ago in terms of the density of the population there, and the earthquake 100 years ago that San Francisco experienced. In terms of magnitude and population densities, they were very similar. Haiti's just a mess. San Francisco, it was really bad, but not nearly as bad as Haiti. This would support your thesis that you can do a lot if you just encourage economic activity
Mm-hmm.
always.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Even better than waiving nonsensible
Mm-hmm.
regulations and zoning laws after disaster strikes would be getting rid of them in the first place
Yes.
for all cases. Protecting in-state electricians, carpenters,
Mm-hmm.
nurses, and physicians from out-of-state competition, that hurts in regular during a normal economic period. It hurts even more after following a natural disaster. So eliminating those laws would help prepare these communities to allow people from other states to quickly come in and aid in response and recovery efforts.
And then, of course, after disasters, we see all kinds of popular policies that are probably quite counterproductive. Of course, not allowing doctors from other areas to come into your region. Quite often what happens is emergency legislation that says you can't gouge consumers. You have to keep prices where they were before the crisis. And this is just from basic economics 101, like the wrong thing to do completely. You encourage shortages and prevent resources from flowing to where they are most needed.
Yeah, absolutely. You need prices to reflect their value.
Mm-hmm.
The disaster made the prices go up.
Mm-hmm.
People pursuing the capitalism didn't make the price go up. The disaster did. And the best way to get that price to go back down is to allow capitalism to work. Producers are going to produce more. Consumers are going to consume less. Prices will encourage that behavior and drive the price down and provide the resources needed in those communities, direct them from all over the nation to where they're needed.
How are people responding to your story? Of course, the mayor was, not real pleased, and that's not a surprise. I'd imagine he wouldn't agree no matter what. But are you hearing from business owners in the two places? Are you hearing from people outside of these two areas who want to learn more about your research? What's been the reaction, especially to the Wall Street Journal piece?
I've gotten a lot of people from sharing their stories to me, both from Tuscaloosa and outside of Tuscaloosa. In fact, there was John Douglas, who owns Home Sports Field Grill in Fultondale, Alabama.
Okay.
He's been Fultondale, Alabama was hit on April 27th as well. They have a top-down approach to recovery efforts, and he's been struggling with the city to rebuild his grill. It's been business for 22 years. And the most heartbreaking part is when I get stories from charities that are trying to build homes in Tuscaloosa. And they say they're having trouble with the city. They're just trying to do good. They have the resources, they have the money, just they can't get a permit to rebuild. Those are hard to read through, but I've received several of those.
We only have a couple of minutes left, and I want to wrap up by just asking you about giving and whether one of your messages is that we shouldn't be giving, or is it just the type of giving that's occurring that you're concerned about? So this discussion of focusing on federal aid and how that just really distorts resource flows and distorts economic activity away from what we should be doing, which is encouraging entrepreneurship and encouraging redevelopment of the area. Is there a difference, though, when charities are doing the giving relative to the federal government handing out money to a disaster area? Do you find significant differences in terms of responsibility, accountability, efficiency in general between the two different sectors?
Absolutely. What we saw for the churches and charities when they got voluntary donations, they would make sure that they were addressing the needs of the people. They were making sure to verify that they had those needs, that they didn't have drug issues, alcohol issues, and they're making sure that they're responsible with those funds and directing those to the best use that they could find. They know those local communities. Whereas the federal money, there's research done by some economists, Leeson and Sobel, that found disaster recovery aid actually increases corruption in communities because people are they're lobbying against each other to get that disaster money. So churches and charities are far better equipped to understand the local community, who in the community is going to take advantage of aid and who isn't, where the disaster areas are, what their needs are. We'd be far better to donate to churches and charities rather than have the federal government come in and distort that process.
One of the things that amazed me when visiting with you in Joplin was the amount of support that came into the area immediately after the disaster from charities and from volunteer groups around the world, people coming from Japan and many other countries to help victims of the tornado in Joplin. But they actually needed a whole distribution process for all of the things that had been given. And you're doing some work on giving and kind of the optimal form of charity. And what are your early preliminary results from that research?
Well, what we heard from the people of Joplin and Tuscaloosa is both of them, the churches and charities in those communities, called disaster donations in kind, so clothing, supplies. They called that the disaster after disaster. They're just trying to respond to the disaster and rebuild their community, and now they have to manage up to 27 warehouses of donated goods. And Tuscaloosa ended up shipping some of those goods straight to Joplin, and Joplin ended up shipping some of those goods to the Mississippi flood victims because they just didn't know what to do with all that stuff. And it takes a lot of volunteers to dig through it. What they preferred is that they wish people would just donate money. If you donate money, then they can depend upon businesses providing the correct amount, correct resources to those people, and they could use that money to direct those resources to the products that they need.
From a straight microeconomic viewpoint, that makes good sense. In a lot of our basic theories, cash is just so much more liquid and helps us allow us to get the things we most value relative to gifts. I'm assuming charities can't take the gifts that come in and then just try to sell them for pennies on the dollar. That's probably against their mission in a lot of cases. Just a big mess, right?
Well, we did have one charity report doing that. That felt like that's the best way that they could serve the people, was actually selling those goods that they received, and then using that cash. That's their mission, is to serve that community. So if they have to employ that means, and this isn't just unique to Joplin, Tuscaloosa. You mentioned Haiti. There's been a lot of research done on donating your shirts or your shoes to the disaster victims in Haiti, and they would be far better off if you donated money rather than in-kind donations. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show today. This is some of the most important work that's going on right now in terms of disaster recovery, and an extremely emotional story when you get down to it. These are people who have had their lives just completely shaken up, and to stand in the way and prevent them from what could make them better as quickly as possible is just tragic. And keep going and keep doing good work in this area.
Thank you very much. Sure. Yeah, I've heard some incredible stories in Joplin and Tuscaloosa, and that's what my research is about, is sharing those stories.
That's great. Thank you. And thank you, viewers, for tuning in tonight. Good night.